Hello everyone, my name is Daniel Terry. I'm an American editor and writer who enjoys playing and talking about video games. In this video, I'm going to be reviewing Moon Studios' Ori and the Blind Forest. If you just want the review score of Ori and the Blind Forest, then I give it a solid 10 out of 10. There are some aspects of the game that I found that detract from it, but ultimately there is no way to make a perfect game that pleases everyone. I absolutely loved my time with Ori and her counterpart, Cien, and I encourage you to do the same. A little after I started this project, I learned that Moon Studios is creating a sequel to Ori and the Blind Forest that is called Ori and the Will of the Wisps. I look forward to playing and reviewing the sequel. This first part is going to be spoiler-free, so if you want to enjoy the game without spoilers, feel free to enjoy the first part of the review. I'll let you know when spoilers are going to come into play. So, what is Ori and the Blind Forest? Ori and the Blind Forest is a Metroidvania platformer that emphasizes exploration and movement over combat. It is roughly 8 to 12 hours in length and features set-piece events over traditional boss encounters. The protagonist, Ori the Spirit Guardian, finds herself alone in a dangerous and unforgiving world that she can't fight back against. But she quickly finds Cien, her friend in Light of the Spirit Tree, who gives her the power to fight back with the Spirit Flame. As the game progresses, Ori discovers the graves of other Spirit Guardians and obtains the powers that her late colleagues had in life. Eventually, Ori encounters and learns the motivations of the story's primary antagonists and must do everything in her power to escape from these encounters. The game's story revolves around Ori being separated from the Spirit Tree, which is essentially Ori's parent, who birthed her as a leaf. Shortly after this separation, a pudgy creature named Naru finds and adopts Ori. The two live a life of plenty, with Naru acting as a mother figure and Ori her child. Anything after this is spoiler territory, but I will tell you that I find the introduction to be both well done and impactful on the player. It hit me square in the field since it touches on a few things that are dear to me. One thing that simply cannot be ignored is the art style. Ori and the Blind Forest focuses on a dreamlike color palette. Both Ori and Cien stand out from this color palette due to them being both bright white and somewhat iridescent. While these dream colors are used for more or less everything in the game, including Naru, it is very clear through Naru's actions that these colors do not immediately denote that something is bad or evil, but instead that these things are simply different from the Spirit Tree and its Spirit Guardians. The game features 3 difficulties, easy, normal, and hard, and the only difference between these is the amount of damage that Ori takes when hit by enemies and environmental hazards. I've heard that on easy, enemies have half health, but I'm not sure about that. On easy, Ori takes roughly half damage from everything, but on hard the amount of damage is doubled. This does lead to overall challenge for the experienced player. My first playthrough, for example, was on hard and I thoroughly enjoyed it. But since Ori and the Blind Forest focuses on environmental set pieces and hazards, some of the later areas can feel unbalanced unless the players collected many of the health upgrades available up until that point. The basic gameplay loop comes into play after Ori finds Cien and is able to use the Spirit Flame ability to attack and kill enemies and destroy some environmental hazards. As time goes on, Ori discovers new abilities and empowers either herself or Cien to overcome obstacles in the environment. But an important thing to remember here is that they never actually need any abilities beyond the Spirit Flame to defeat all the killable enemies in the game. The thing about the Spirit Flame ability is that it automatically targets enemies and destructible elements of the terrain, so that the player can focus on avoiding damage. For this reason, Ori and the Blind Forest becomes a dance where the player focuses on dodging instead of simply killing enemies. No damage taken is not only possible, but preferable to the strategy of trading where the player takes damage to quickly kill foes. Beyond this loop, the abilities that Ori and Cien gain allow them to destroy some barriers with a Spirit Bomb, throw exploding enemies into barriers only said enemies can destroy, dodge quickly to the left and right, double jump, rocket upwards, slam downwards, and much more. By the end of the game, the duo will have some 12 abilities to use, and while this isn't a bad thing, some of the abilities more or less replace one another due to more powerful later abilities doing the same thing as earlier ones. This can lead to a sense of empowerment and progress, but at the same time, some may find this to be needlessly complex. Pursuant to progress, Ori and the Blind Forest features a leveling system and 3 ability trees for the player to build in. Killed enemies and obstacles drop Spirit Light, the experience points of the game, and gathering enough of these points releases a shockwave that kills most, if not all, enemies on the screen, in addition to fully healing Ori and refilling her magic pool. These ability trees are Offense, Utility, and Defense. Offense increases the power of Cien's Spirit Flame ability as well as other offensive abilities. The focus is on dealing damage as quickly and efficiently as possible, with its capstone being that Spirit Flame can target 4 targets at once. Utility focuses on making pickups and experience points more impactful on Ori. The single most important ability here is Spirit Efficiency, since it increases the amount of Spirit Light that Ori gains from killing enemies. The capstone here allows Ori to see through walls, which dramatically increases the player's ability to collect all the collectibles in the game. Defense focuses on giving Ori more options for moving throughout the environment and dodging attacks. Three notable abilities here are Rekindle, which allows Ori to reuse player-made save points, Air Dash, which allows her to use her dash ability while in the air, and Water Breath, which allows her to breathe clean water. One of the important things here is that I said clean water. Most of the water in the game is purple before the Jinzo Tree event. This means that Ori takes damage whenever she's in these waters. After the Jinzo Tree event, however, she's able to swim through them no problem. If you collect most of the collectibles, you should be able to complete 2 of the 3 trees and part of a third. In my playthrough, I didn't start leveling offense until the very end of the game, but this didn't offer any real hang-ups where I felt I was up against what is called a damage check, which is any encounter where the player needs to be able to dish out a certain amount of damage or lose by default. My progress path was to fully fill out the utility tree and collect everything in the overworld, and after that, I filled in the defense tree. By this point, I was finished with 3/4 of the game, and the enemies didn't seem to be taking all that much longer to kill. The offensive tree seems to be needless for my evasive playstyle, and I wonder if it's more there for people playing on easy who need to kill enemies after being hit once or twice. Speaking of enemies, the enemy design in the game is fantastic, and the game's mechanics interface well with them. I have a few complaints here and there, but overall the presentation is top-notch. Since I have fewer complaints than I do compliments, let's get the negative out of the way first. Early on in the game, the player encounters an enemy that sprays spines at them. This isn't the problem, but the spines present an issue since they are one of the few, if not the only projectile in the game that cannot be redirected with Ori's bash ability. The problem here is that nearly every other projectile in the game can be redirected, so it feels like part of the game isn't playing by its own rules. On to the good parts. All the enemies in the game use predictable attack patterns, and many of them attack where you were instead of where you will be. This emphasizes dodging and focuses on the game's core mechanic of evading damage instead of simply enduring it. To push this further, there are speedruns of this game where the player never collects health upgrades, spends ability points on the ability tree, or in any other way increases Ori's survivability. This simply isn't possible in a game that isn't designed with all of this in mind. Very few games can do this, and the only ones that I can really think of are the Soulsborne series, which can be done at base level, and maybe a few other ones. This said, there are aspects of the game that I can't speak about without spoilers, so at this point I'm heading into spoiler territory. If you want to experience the game without spoilers, then I recommend you pause the video, follow the links below, buy the game, and play it for yourself. This video will still be here when you're done. Okay, I'll start moving into spoilers now. Naru dies. It is sad. I cried. Ori isn't big enough to properly bury Naru, so she has to leave her there and strike out on her own. But there is a problem. Ori isn't strong enough to survive in the world on her own. As a result, she struggles, she fails, and she, too, dies. A moment later, the spirit tree lends her its power, and she is brought back to life. At this point, Ori is able to run, jump, and do sick backflips. She's quite the acrobat, as seen by her bounding through the air if the player has her jump 3 times while running in the same direction. Ori's movement portrays her carefree nature. Sein represents a more serious character in the story, but he never restricts Ori nor the player in any way. This makes sense to a degree when considering how Sein, the Spirit Tree, and the Spirit Guardians all live in a mutually beneficial society, with the Spirit Guardians essentially being the little brothers and sisters of the other two. Since the lifespans of Spirit Guardians are never stated and Sein has intimate knowledge of these Guardians' abilities, I can assume that everyone was more or less able to communicate freely over an extremely long period of time. The very first thing you have to do in Ori to get anywhere in the game is to find Sein, who unlocks the Spirit Flame ability. From here, you quickly unlock Wall Jump, but something curious happens. When you find your first save point and save your game, you see an area that requires Wall Jump to traverse, and as a result, when you do get Wall Jumped, you're probably going to come back to this spot and see what's behind it. I absolutely love this kind of design. It is the gameplay equivalent of having a character in a series cameo in an earlier novel or short story, just to make the audience wonder who he or she is. The players, or in my analogy, the reader's, curiosity is piqued, and much like cats, he or she is going to explore the point of interest as soon as possible unless something else shows up. The masterful part here is that this new area has stronger enemies in it, is filled with environmental hazards that are more or less going to kill Ori the moment they touch her, and has floating platforms. Even better, at a certain point Ori picks up something that enables her to move through some of the barriers and stand on the formerly invisible platforms, but this comes at the cost of her mobility. In essence, it's still fighting and platforming, but it's also a puzzle. I thoroughly enjoyed this section of the game, and it represents the earliest great part of the game. The thing that's important to keep in mind here is that the area that I'm talking about, which is known as the Moon Grotto, was added in the definitive edition of Ori and the Blind Forest, meaning that this did not exist in the original release. There was a moment where I wondered if I needed some other ability to complete the Moon Grotto, but I decided to trust Moon Studios and press on by making a save in this hellhole. I should point out that I had 1 hit point at this point, which on hard means that everything killed me in 1 hit. This upped the challenge and made the level far more enjoyable for me. At the end of all of this, Ori gets her dodge ability, and it more or less replaces normal running for the most part. One other thing to add to this is that this is an addition for the definitive edition. In the normal edition of Ori and the Blind Forest, there is no ground dash. What's important is that the dark area and the dodge are both completely optional. You never need to get them to complete Ori and the Blind Forest. At this point, Cien has told Ori that she needs to go to the Spirit Tree. This tells me that until Ori gets the ground pound ability and can access the area under the dark place, the player doesn't need to enter this location. Instead, Ori is supposed to go to the Spirit Tree and to go to what is easily the best set-piece event in the entire game, the Jinzo Tree. Simply put, the Jinzo Tree is where Ori is at its best. It starts out with multiple jumping puzzles that involve a teleportation gimmick that is all set over what is essentially a death pit. This area typifies good design, and the puzzles grow in complexity as the tree goes on. About 1/3 of the way through the tree, Ori gains the Bash ability, which allows her to redirect enemy projectiles while launching herself in the opposite direction. The next 6 of the tree is a tutorial that teaches the player to use Bash to traverse through the environment. In essence, enemies and their projectiles become new methods of traversal, and many formerly inaccessible areas become accessible with this ability. Then we come to the set piece, the heart of the Jinzo Tree. Corruption, the name for most of the environmental hazards in the game, has grown over the heart, and Ori must find a way to destroy this corruption. This area acts as a check to ensure that you understand how to use the Bash ability properly. The game doesn't even stop at 1 check, but you have to successfully perform Bash multiple times to proceed from here. Once you do, what is arguably the best part of the game starts, the escape from the Jinzo Tree. This set piece requires Ori to use Bash more or less constantly, and the waters of the Jinzo Tree are always rising. Moon Studios, the developer if you've forgotten by now, were smart enough to realize that some players are going to fly through the Jinzo Tree while others are going to struggle, so they made the rising waters dynamic. If the player is slow to bypass obstacles, the water moves at its slowest rate and will catch up with and kill Ori after 2 or 3 mistakes, but if the player flies through with no problem, the waters will chase Ori to stay right behind her. As long as I didn't think about it and embrace the idea that I was being pursued by a force of nature so unfathomably powerful compared to Ori that it didn't matter, I had a wonderful time with the event and it kept me on the edge of my seat. This all said, the game expects you to die here a lot. 3 things make this very clear to me. Firstly, when you die, you reset very quickly and the event begins immediately instead of you needing to retrigger it. Secondly, the game saves right after the Jinzo Tree event starts. Thirdly, the music never stops nor resets. This means that the player is never taken out of the experience by failure since it all sounds and feels like one big event. This is design that says, hey, we know this is hard, but as with most hard things, the feeling that you're going to get when you reach the other side is going to make it all worth it. It is easily the best set piece in the game, as I've said before, and while the other set pieces attempt to emulate it, they all fail to live up to it. This does lead to a common trend with the set pieces. Each one features a specific gimmick. In the Jinzo Tree, it is teleporters. In another, it is a platform that the player can use to orient themselves to fall in any orthogonal direction, such as up, down, left, or right. And in the last one, it is disabling magma flows that reveal the next area. This inclusion of a gimmick ensures that the player has something new after having explored the game's overworld for so long. There is another set-piece-like area beneath the Moon Grotto that I spoke about earlier, but it mainly involves dodging moving pillars with no pursuing threat, so I don't really count it since it doesn't seem to have a real gimmick. If the player has never seen one of these puzzles before or decides to just rush in, or he might die. Before I talk about the other set pieces, I want to talk about the overworld a little bit more. Prior to the player triggering the Jinzo Tree event, the waters in the overworld are purple and poisonous to Ori. In some games, this means that if the water is poison, the player shouldn't try to see what's on the other side. In Ori, this means that if you can at least get to the other side of the water and save your game, you can complete the rest of it without issue. When I did this, I found myself in a situation that screamed that I'd worked my way into a bad situation and now had to fight my way out of it. I struggled for at least 30 minutes, maybe an hour, but eventually I overcame it. The important part here is that in Ori, if you see a challenge and say, "Challenge accepted," you can save midway through without worrying about endangering your save. Most newer Metroidvania games are good about this, but occasionally one comes along that does this poorly and results in permanent failed states that require restarting the game. To make this as clear as possible, just imagine that you were able to swim into an area that you had to swim out of, but all the water hurt you. You wasted more than 2/3 of your health getting to that point, and then you decided to save. In this case, you can't escape. It's literally impossible for you to get out of there if you don't have some sort of way to heal yourself. So in that case, you'd have to just restart the game. As Ori explores the overworld, she's going to come to a point where she just can't progress without dealing with Kuro, the game's main villain. One such section is where Kuro blocks the way forward and Ori needs to drop a boulder on her head to be able to progress. Doing this clears the path and knocks a feather off of Kuro. Ori grabs this feather and is able to start using it to either glide downward at a controlled pace or ride updrafts into the sky. This opens up later parts of the map and the player learns to feather the ability to gain, maintain, or lose altitude. The second set piece I want to talk about is intended to teach the player how to master these floating controls, but it's a far cry from the Jinzhou tree's experience. I may be a bit harsh on this set piece for reasons that I'm going to get into a little bit later. You see, I was playing on hard my first time through, and had I collected half the health increases that I had up to this point, I might have been stuck on this event for far longer than I had. I'm getting a bit ahead of myself, however, and I should tell you about what leads up to this point. The Misty Woods is an area that instills a sense of vulnerability and apprehensiveness in the player, and it does this by both denying the player the use of the map and changing the environments. What I mean by the first part is that there isn't a map for the Misty Woods once the player activates the central gimmick. The central gimmick about the Misty Woods is that it fills the area with mist that gets Ori lost. The second part, its central gimmick, is that the environment changes off-screen. A dead end might open up towards progress, but the player never really knows when this is going to happen. Worse, the enemies are strong in this area, and it features plenty of puzzles where Ori uses Kuro's feather to descend into spiked pits, all the while being attacked by enemies. The aspect that makes this section so dread-inducing is that there are very few health pickups here, so Ori is almost always going to be 1 or 2 hits from death. Overall, the gimmick works great, and at the end of it, Ori unlocks the ability to run up walls. The Forlorn Ruins area is the next set-piece environment that Ori works her way into. Remember a while ago when I was talking about stones that would allow Ori to fall in any direction? This is a level where the player finds these. In essence, the entire level is a slow walk where Ori has to fight enemies while not being able to take advantage of her mobility. The thing that makes all of this work is a heavy stone infused with the Spirit Tree's light, and carrying it is what makes Ori so slow. The main reason I point this out is that in some parts of the level, Ori has to drop the stone to progress. What is important here is that the stone teleports to Ori after a few seconds if she either fails to pick it up or if the stone falls into some unreachable location. This once again is showing us that Moon Studios anticipated potential issues, and designed the puzzles such that Ori would always have access to whatever she needed. This is good design. I like it. Another aspect of the Forlorn Ruins is the inclusion of lasers. Many of these are intermittent while others are constantly moving, but they all have one thing in common. They kill Ori the instant they touch her. Many of the jumping puzzles in the Forlorn Ruins include these lasers, and I'm hard-pressed to find one that I think is cheap or random. This does, however, show up in the overworld as well, so I can't really say it's specifically a gimmick just for the Forlorn Ruins. Returning to the second set piece of the game in the Forlorn Ruins, Ori restarts the heart in the ruins and frees the winds. This essentially causes the ruins to start falling apart, and the only way out is up. As I said previously, I may have been a bit harsh here, but much of this section is less about learning the puzzle and more about dealing with the random elements in the set piece. Icicles are falling from the top of the screen at random as predictable blasts of freezing air burst from the walls. As I said previously, I played on hard, so I could get a hit at a grand total of 5 times compared to the 10 on normal or 20 on easy. On easy, someone might be able to get through the event just by running on the spikes, but on normal or hard, I don't think that would be an option. After the Forlorn Ruins, Ori is able to travel to an area known as the Sorrow Pass, a fire-themed area. As you could likely guess, this is leading towards the volcano in the back of the world map. There are a lot of fire beams here, similar to the lasers in the Forlorn Ruins, which kill Ori in 1 hit. It's great to see Moon Studios building upon mechanics, as the reuse of a hazard allows them to introduce new gimmicks. In this case, Ori needs to move boulders throughout the level using her bash ability. This is central to progressing to Part 2 of the Sorrow Pass, which is a gigantic flying puzzle. The ceiling, floor, and walls are all spiked, so if the player has not mastered the art of feathering Kuro's feather to maintain altitude, that skill is going to be developed by force here. After overcoming the Sorrow Pass, Ori enters Mount Horu, which consists of the third major set piece of the game. In essence, Mount Horu consists of a series of puzzles and screens that have the objective of stopping the magma flows. The volcano's magma level lowers each time Ori seals a magma flow. Beyond this, however, there isn't too much to this area aside from a smaller mini set piece that has Ori fleeing from a huge wave of magma. At the end of Mount Horu, we are introduced to the last of many encounters with the great Owl Kuro, and this one is just awesome. Before we get to that, however, let's talk about the previous encounter with Kuro that teaches us her primary mechanic. Kuro is big and slow, while Ori is small and fast. This is shown mechanically by Kuro needing to be able to see Ori for several seconds to find the Spirit Guardian, but if Ori can slip behind cover before Kuro gets to her, she can hide from the Great Owl. If Ori fails to find a hiding spot in time, Kuro kills her instantly. This first event happens after the Forlorn Ruins, where Ori finds herself in Kuro's nest. In short, stay behind cover. It's a very simple mechanic. In the final encounter, Ori has to escape from Kuro in a climactic spectacle that uses most, if not all, of the powers and abilities that she's used throughout the game. This event is hard, very hard, but it's probably the single most enjoyable set piece in the entire game. The music is upbeat, Kuro is a constant threat, the environment kills Ori if she takes too long, and all the mechanics come together. It's great. I liked it. In the end, well, I did say there were going to be spoilers. Kuro mortally injures Ori, but Naru is there to show some maternal instincts towards the fallen spirit guardian. Kuro sees that her path of destruction has doomed the entire forest, and, more importantly, her children along with it. So she decides to put Cien back in the spirit tree to save her remaining egg. This kills Kuro, but it revives the spirit tree, the spirit guardians, and we watch Ori live a happy life afterwards. It seems that so long as the spirit tree lives, the spirit guardians are able to endure mortal injury. Again, I highly recommend that you go buy Ori and the Blind Forest if you haven't played it. Watching speedruns or Let's Plays really doesn't do the game justice, as it is primarily about exploration. Again, my name has been Daniel Terry, and thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video.